Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd as we continue our study of the Scriptures. Now, the title of our devotional today is The Lord is God. Our scripture reading still in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Well, our study of Ezekiel's prophecies does continue in Ezekiel 5 and 6 today. And though God's prophet to the captives in Babylon, Ezekiel's prophecy concerned Jerusalem's imminent humiliation and judgment. And so a word of reminder, at this point in our study, we have Ezekiel, who is among the Babylonian captives, but God is revealing to him news of events that are happening in Jerusalem so that the people might know. So, Ezekiel 5, first of all, we have the signs of Jerusalem's humiliation and judgment. Now, to illustrate the Lord's judgment of those who remained in Jerusalem, Ezekiel was commanded to shave his head and beard. Now, those were cultural signs of sorrow and humiliation. Then the prophet was instructed to divide his hair into three parts, Ezekiel 5 and verse 1. And this was to illustrate Jerusalem's imminent fall and suffering. Now, each part of his hair served as a symbolic portrayal of how the inhabitants of Judah's capital city would perish. For instance, Ezekiel was instructed to burn 1/3 of his hair, thus symbolizing how the people would perish by fire and disease. A second portion of his hair was to be cut in pieces by a knife, portraying 1/3 of Jerusalem's inhabitants would die by the sword. And then the prophet was to scatter in the wind the last third of his hair and beard. Finally, a few remaining hairs were to be sewn into the hem of his robe, representing a remnant of souls the Lord promised to preserve, though some would be slain, even of that number. Now, we, by the way, noted in earlier readings of 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 40, these facts that did come to pass. Now, if you would, consider with me verses 5 through 17 of Ezekiel 5. And here we have the sins of Jerusalem demanded the Lord's judgment. Now, Jerusalem's inhabitants were guilty of wickedness and provoked the Lord's anger and judgment. Now, though they were chosen by the Lord and blessed with his law and commandments, the people broke their covenant with the Lord. And having rejected the Lord, the people worshipped idols, and in the depths of their depravity, they turned to cannibalism. As we read, fathers did eat the sons in the midst, and the sons eat their fathers. Ezekiel 5, 9, and 10. Lastly, they defiled the temple. We read in verses 11 and 12, for they worshipped idols even within the holy sanctuary of the Lord. Well, then we have the cause of the Lord's judgment. Now, Jerusalem's destruction served as a testimony of the Lord's righteous indignation, according to verse 13. And so the ruins of the city became a reproach and a taunt and an instruction and astonishment unto other nations. Ezekiel foretold that the captives living in Babylon, the miserable end of those living in Jerusalem, for they suffered famine, verse 16. And those who did not die by starvation would die by disease, plagues, and the sword, we read in verse 17. Now that brings us to Ezekiel 6. Now the Lord came to Ezekiel in chapter 6, and he addressed him again as, and I quote, Son of man, and then commanded him in verse 2, Set thy face towards the mountains of Israel, and prophesy against them. Now, let's consider verses 2 through 7, the prophecy against the mountains, which really was a prophecy of the destruction of idol places. So why prophesy against the mountains? For it was in the mountains where Israel and Judah had worshipped idols. Indeed, from reading verse 3, it appears that the whole countryside of the nation was full of places of idol worship. The mountains, the hills, the rivers, the valleys were all places of idolatry, where all manner of evil was committed in the name of worship. Now, What was Ezekiel to prophesy about those places and the people who worshipped idols there? In a word, judgment. Now the Lord warned, and I quote, "Behold, I, even I, will bring a sword upon you, and I will destroy your high places, your altars, and your images shall be broken." Verses 3 and 4. But not only would the idols be destroyed, but those who worshipped and placed them above the Creator would be slain, and we read that their bodies would be stacked and left among the idols. Added an even greater humiliation, the bones of the dead would find their resting place scattered among their broken altars. For those who rejected the Lord, every vestige of their lives would be destroyed. In verse 6, their homes and cities would be laid waste. In verse 7, with none to bury them, the slain would fall in the midst. In other words, they would be left to rot or to become meat or food for birds and wild animals. And then we have the promise of mercy to a remnant, verses 8 through 10. Well, the Lord in His mercy, He did, as He had promised, spared a few, a remnant, who would, in verse 8, be scattered among the nations. Now those spared would remember how they sinned against the Lord and broke His heart with their idolatry in verse 9. We read that they would loathe their wickedness and all they suffered. In verse 10, they would remember and confess that the God of Israel is Lord. But then we have the provocation for God's judgment, verses 11 through 14. Now, to demonstrate God's disgust with the evil abominations of His people, Ezekiel was, and I quote, to smite with his hand and stamp with his foot, in verse 11. The prophet warned, because they sinned against the Lord, they would die, verse 11, by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. Well, a closing thought for today's devotional. What befell Jerusalem served as a reminder that God is just, His word is true, and His promises will come to pass. Every generation must remember that the Lord has declared, and I quote, "Vengeance belongeth unto the Lord." You see, no sin shall go unpunished. All that befell Jerusalem reminded the people in captivity as well as the nations that the Lord is God. And though He is merciful, He is also just and has no tolerance for sin. Well, dear one, thank you for being a part of today's Heart of a Shepherd. We are plodding our way through this rather long book of prophecy, and yet I believe that you're going to find it is very rich, and I hope that you'll continue to follow it. I do want to invite you to go to my website, heartofashepherd.com, and subscribe that you might receive these daily devotionals as an email, as well as the advantage of this daily YouTube devotion. God bless you, and bye-bye.